Ryan, Tov, Boker Tov, Erev Tov, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. It is such a tremendous honor and pleasure for me to be with you all again today. As Julie so warmly said, I am Rabbi Lauren Tuchman, and I am thrilled to be continuing this series on the Aish Kodesh, which is the name of a sefer or a book written by the Piaseczna Rebbe, who is also known as the Warsaw Ghetto Rabbi. But his work is much more voluminous than that. He wrote many different books. We will be focusing in our session on the same text that we talked about last week. For those of you who were not with us last week, no worries, fear not. I am going to first recap and actually reread what we did last week, and then we're going to jump into the new material. And the reason I'm doing that is for two reasons. I think it's very important to review. And I also want to make sure that everything is contiguous and makes good sense, right? Because this is a very dense text. There's a lot of background knowledge that's interwoven, I believe, into this text. I'm going to be explaining the new material as we go, and I encourage anyone who is interested or hasn't had a chance to, the recording of last week is available on YouTube. We will be completing, God willing, the text today. I also want to make sure that we leave ample time at the end of our session today for Q&A. And the way that I'm going to ask folks to do the Q&A is to chat privately to Julie, and then Julie will then read questions when it comes time for the Q&A, and then I will take them from there. I think that that's going to be, from a facilitation perspective, I think that's going to be the smoothest way to go. So just use the chat box. I will not be checking it as I'm teaching, but I hope to look at it briefly afterwards. And again, the questions that you put in the chat box, God willing, I will be able to get to a number of them at the end of this shiur. So I'm gonna recap and kind of reread a bit of what we did last week. So again, we are looking at a text from the Aish Kodesh, which is a series of commentaries on the weekly Parsha, or Parsha HaShavua, that the Piaseczna Rebbe wrote while interned in the Warsaw Ghetto from 1939 to 1942. And these were not written every week. They were, though, compiled at the end of that time and actually buried in a canister and then discovered after the war. And these drashot, or these commentaries, were based on talks that he gave on Shabbat. And because traditionally one does not write on Shabbat, what typically happens is that when a Hasidic Rebbe would give a talk on Shabbat, their followers, their disciples, whatever word you want to use there, who had a really good oral memory and recall, would try to remember everything their Rebbe said, and they would then, after Shabbat was over, they would then write out what they recalled having heard. So often that is how a lot of Hasidic commentaries have come down to us. A lot of them were given during a time of Shabbat called Sudash Shlishit, which is the third meal of the Sabbath and is considered to be the holiest time of Shabbat itself. It's the time in which we are bidding Shabbat goodbye. We're so sad to do so. We're in the last few hours. We've been through this period of holy time and holy space, and now we're about to enter into the actual 6 days of work. But before we do that, we want to make sure we bring in more Torah. So that's a bit of context for where we are in terms of thinking about this sefer. So I'm going to now, this text that we are talking about was written as a commentary to Parsha Ki Teitzei, which is one of the latter parshiot, or portions, in the book of Deuteronomy. And it was written in September of 1940. And so I'm just going to very, very quickly review with us what we did last week, just so that we are caught up to speed. I'm going to summarize it very quickly, and then I'm going to continue with the new material. I am reading strictly from the English on this source sheet. You have the original Hebrew, and I encourage to follow along if you wish. You can also just listen to me read. And having the original text there is something you can look at it in your own time, but because I want to make sure we are all using a common language and a common vocabulary, I'm going to be reading exclusively in English. Okay, So it is taught in the name of the holy rabbi, the godly man, the great Maggid of Nazareth, who was one of the earliest Hasidic rabbis, the blessed of blessed memory, on the verse. This is a verse from Psalms. You are a priest, Kohen, forever. That Kohen refers to the attribute of chesed, loving kindness. You, the fact that a person of Israel is capable of saying to God, you are blessed, Baruch atah. This is a chesed from God, because you implies presence, i.e. second person, whereas he, who, in Hebrew, is hidden third person. And when the men of the Great Assembly established that in our prayer and blessings, we address God as you, followed by the divine name and kingship, it must mean that these words are effective in bringing about a divine revelation, such that God is actually present before us, and we can truly say you, and it is not a blessing made in vain, God forbid. This relates to what is taught in our holy books, that just as prayer requires Torah, as the verse says, one who turns their ear away from hearing Torah, their prayer is also despicable or disgusting. So too, Torah requires prayer. And this can be understood according to what we said above. For we say, blessed are you, Hashem, who teaches Torah to your nation Israel, meaning to the entire nation. But for God to learn/teach with each individual person and speak to each and every one, each person needs to make that happen. In the opening verses of Vayikra, Rashi comments, so Rashi is a famous medieval commentator, and Vayikra is the book of Leviticus. It was a voice to him, a voice directed to him alone. Moshe heard it, and the rest of Israel did not hear. So in other words, the opening word of Vayikra, and he called, refers to God calling Moshe in a very particular way, meaning that Moshe Rabbeinu also heard the voice to him, the voice directed to him alone, in an intimate and private communication to him. And the rest of Israel, even though Hashem teaches together with them, it is not to them or directed to them individually. Rather, God teaches Torah to the nation and to the entire collective of Israel. And each and every person needs to bring about that Hashem speaks with them individually too, as we described above. So I'm going to just quickly summarize what I've read there, and then we're going to continue on with the new material. So, as is the case in a lot of Hasidic drashot, the Piaseczna Rebbe here is talking about the opening verse in Parashat Ki Tetzei Lemilchama, when you go out to war. The opening bit of this parsha is about how we behave in warfare. But instead of talking about war, the Ki Tetzei Lemilchama, when you go out, he's really focusing on this notion of you, and he's focusing on the idea of how we have an experiential conversation with God. The Piaseczna is really interested in divine service and Avodat Hashem, and is very interested in figuring out a way to really make that something that people can grasp onto. And that is a big piece of his teaching. Spiritual life is very important. The inner life is very important. How we work on ourselves internally is very important. So what's happening here is a twofold phenomenon. And he's quoting earlier Hasidic sources, and he's going to continue to quote later Hasidic sources, which we will see as we continue. And he's effectively saying here that we as the Jewish people, or the Jewish tradition, allows for the individual davener, the individual prayer, to address God with the second person singular. So when we make a blessing, when we make a bracha, we say, Baruch atah Hashem, blessed are you, Hashem, Elokeinu melech haolam, our God, ruler of the universe, or eternal ruler of the universe. And what's interesting and important to really note here is that when we say Baruch atah Hashem, we are invoking Hashem, we are blessing Hashem as if we are able to have a really deeply intimate conversation experientially with Hashem. That Hashem is not out there detached, but rather the second person you is a very personal and intimate way of address. We are not addressing a detached God. We are actually really meant to consider ourselves to be having a very intimate encounter with the divine presence. And because we are able to do that, that is a chesed from God, that is a kindness that we are allowed and encouraged to be in such a direct and unmediated relationship. We don't have to ask permission. We aren't somehow like subjects of a big royal king, even though of course later in the blessings we do invoke kingship. But we are really like very much children of a loving parent. That is kind of the metaphor that I would like to use to describe what he's referring to here. And so that's part one. So part one is saying we have an ability to have a deeply personal and intimate encounter with God, and ideally an intimate conversation with God. And because that's a chesed that God has given us, we are able to engage in that every time we make a bracha, which traditionally it's important to also note that there is an idea that we make 100 brachot a day, traditionally. So there are 100 opportunities to say Baruch atah, blessed are you. And often more than that. But there's an idea traditionally that we make 100 brachot a day. So that is the first piece. And the second piece, which comes right out of that, is that Torah is both collective and individual. So in the brachot that we traditionally make over the Torah, over Torah study rather, not over the Torah, over Torah study in the morning, we thank Hashem in the traditional liturgy. And again, like I am referring explicitly to traditional davening. Different people have different sidurim that they daven with, and that's wonderful. And we have a lot of different kind of practices and approaches. But the Piaseczna here would be referring to the traditional bracha, which we say for Torah study. And the bracha ends by thanking Hashem for teaching Torah to Amo Yisrael, to all of the nation of Israel. So in that sense, we're talking about a collective Torah. We're talking about the kind of Torah that we find in the Sefer Torah, the kind of Torah that we find in books of Torah, that's the Torah that we all are being taught all of the time. And that's the Torah that we share as a collective. And the second piece of that, and the individual piece, is that just like Moshe in the book of Vayikra, in the opening line of the book of Vayikra, the words there are Vayikra Moshe, there's an idea that Moshe had this intimate encounter with Hashem, with God, in which he heard God's voice directly to him. And I would also say, as I mentioned last week, that this also relates to the Midrash, right, that says that all souls were at Mount Sinai, all Jewish souls were at Mount Sinai to receive the Torah. And at the same time, there's an idea of Shiv'im Panim LaTorah, that there are 70 faces of Torah, which has been understood to mean infinite interpretations of Torah are available to us. And I would also say in this case can be understood as every single person hears or experiences or intuits, or whatever word we want to use there, a particular aspect of Torah that they hear, they understand, interpret, listen to, that other people do not hear or experience in the same way. And that just as Moshe Rabbeinu, just as Moses, our teacher, did that, says the Piaseczna, so too can we each do that for ourselves, that we can turn within and listen deeply for the voice that tells us about the individual part of Torah that really gels with our neshama, that really just touches our soul in a particular way. So we are inheritors of Torah writ large as a general revelatory process and idea and book and all of those things. Torah is a very broad term. And we are simultaneously inheritors, according to the Piaseczna and many others, of the idea that we can access a particular piece of Torah that is very uniquely our own, that we will not, that other people don't experience in the same way. I will say in my own experience, this is very true for me. There are pieces of Torah that I have a particular relationship to that just really feel very intuitively like they're things that I need to bring out into the world. This is a particular Hasidic way of understanding Quran, understanding Revelation, and understanding everyone's role in that process. So I'm going to continue reading the text. Through prayer, how can one make this happen? Through prayer, when a person says you and affects a divine revelation that is present to them, and then Hashem speaks to them and teaches Torah to them individually, likewise, with the language of you in presence. And each individual sees and perceives their own portion of Torah that Hashem communicates to them and teaches them, which no other person perceives. And another person perceives something which they cannot perceive. As is taught in the holy book, Ma'or Shemesh, on the verse in Psalms, God's secrets are given to the awestruck, for secrets, sod, are not limited to the study of Kabbalah, for that is already written in books and anybody can study it. Rather, the perception of divinity that each individual perceives and no other person perceives, and that which each individual perceives with the blessing, with the blessed divinity, which is impossible to explain to another, that is called a secret. So what's going on here is that the Piaseczna is referring to his ancestor, the Ma'or Shemesh, and talking about, we're not talking about the secrets of Kabbalah, because at that point, at the point in which the Piaseczna is teaching and the point at which the Ma'or Shemesh is teaching, the Kabbalah is already available to anybody who wants to go and study it. Now, I want to name here that traditionally, Kabbalah is understood to be available only to married men over the age of 40, and the reason for that is because Kabbalah is the kind of Torah that that traditionally is understood. You have to have mastered the entire Torah and the entire Tanakh and the entire Mishnah and Gemara before you can even then consider looking at the Kabbalah. So the idea is Kabbalah is not something you can just jump into. You actually need a lot of preparation. You need to be familiar with the entire Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh and the Talmud, the Gemara and the Mishnah, and all of those things. You need to have a groundedness with that before you can even think to go into Kabbalah. So he's not talking about the Kabbalah. He's not talking about the word sod as we understand it Kabbalistically. He's talking about sod as that piece of Torah which we perceive, but no one else perceives the same way. And that is what we have to tune ourselves into and really get in touch with. And this can be accessed, excuse me, through prayer, in which a person brings oneself to stand in God's presence and speak with God as you, and God speaks with them in turn individually as you, as we stated above. So again, we are really drawing down on the idea that the goal here is that prayer is something that we are meant to engage in as a conversation. In Hebrew, the root for prayer, or the word for prayer, lahid palel, the root of pei lamed lamed, talks about connection. And even though there are different kinds of Jewish prayer that different scholars of liturgy understand in very different ways, as praise, petition, thanks, various categories in which tefillot, in which Jewish prayers have been put into. Ultimately, what we are seeking to understand here is that prayer is very much a conversation and not a detached activity. So let's just name an important thing here, but this is wonderful and aspirational and beautiful. And I would bet that most of us are not at this point. I know I'm not. I know that, in my own spiritual practice, I don't necessarily think of the intimacy of a divine conversation as an automatic given, right? But this is a beautiful aspiration that he's encouraging all of us to get into, that we are each able to access this if this theology resonates, and it may not, which is also totally wonderful. Take what works and leave the rest. But for him and his theology, I think what is deeply empowering for him is that as I'm understanding this particular teaching, is that prayer is not only for people who are quote unquote Jewishly literate. Prayer is not only for those who have a particular practice with the Siddur, but actually the fact that a blessing, any blessing we make, whether it's in formal prayer, in the Amidah, in the formal standing prayer, whether it's a blessing over food, whether it's any of the brachot, any of the many brachot that we make, all begin with Baruch Atah, blessed are you, because every one of us has the ability to have this unmediated access to the divine. Okay, give me 1 second. But in order for the words that we, speak in presence to bring about divine revelation with presence, the one who is praying needs to first be revealed through their words of prayer, meaning that one's own self needs to be found in their words of prayer. And then, as water reflects the face to the face, this causes God's revelation to be present before them too. And even when one's prayer comes from the depths of their heart, due to suffering, God save us, nonetheless, since their soul is poured out and is present in their words of prayer, this already brings about a divine revelation that is present to them individually. So again, we're really just drilling down on the point that we've made earlier, that the Piaseczna in this drasha, in this commentary, really wants us to be focusing on the individual, private, unmediated relationship with God. This also assumes a theology that includes a personal God. Different people throughout Jewish history and ad hayom until today have a variety of different understandings of God's relationship with us as human beings and with us as individuals and with us as a people. So those are things to name here, but the theology, as I understand it, in this particular commentary is premised on the I thou, as Martin Buber would call it, the you and I relationship as being sacrosanct and central. So that actually concludes our text. And I'm now going to just offer time for questions and reflections. So if anyone has, we've got about 15 minutes left, and I would really love to address any and all comments, questions, reflections that you may have.
And again, for those who may have joined late, if you could direct your questions in the chat to me, and then I can read them out loud. And if someone prefers Rabbi Tuchman to be unmuted and ask their question, is that possible too?
Oh, I'm totally fine with that, absolutely.
Okay, great. Okay, so we have a question from Rachel. Is this a message throughout the rabbi's teaching or only once in the ghetto?
So I will say that my knowledge of all of the Piasetzna's books is not comprehensive at this point. But through the limited study that I have done, I think that this is a pretty constant idea that shows up, at least in the experiences that I've had and the people I've learned the Piaseczna with, I think that this general idea is very omnipresent, that this is kind of a mainstay. If anyone knows more about that, I'm happy to talk about that offline, but that is my general understanding at this point.
Okay, thanks. A question from Cornelia. I'm curious about the revelation people receive from God after honest prayer. Do we have a sense of what the Rebbe thought this might look like? Also, I'm assuming these were written in Polish or Yiddish and Hebrew, or were they written completely in Hebrew?
Thank you, Cornelia. I love those questions. I'll take the second one first. Truthfully, I'm actually not clear on whether or not these were written in Yiddish, Polish, and or Hebrew exclusively. I believe that they were written mostly in Hebrew. I'm actually almost, now that I'm thinking about that, I'm almost certain that they were written exclusively in Hebrew. But I don't want to say that with 100% certainty, so I want to look that up and get back to you. So that's the second half. And in terms of what do we think that this honest revelation looks like after prayer, you know, it's really hard. I mean, I've had the same question, and I've really sat with that question. I'm trying to imagine what the Rebbe thought that could mean. And I'm thinking about the context. I mean, this was one of the earlier, relatively speaking, it's not the first drash in Aish Kodesh, but it is one of the earlier pieces, because the Sefer ends in 1942 with Parashat Chazon, which is the Shabbat before, Shabbat Chazon, not Parashat Chazon, Shabbat Chazon, which is the Shabbat before Tisha B'Av. So we're at a point in the Sefer in which things are getting bad, but it's hard to imagine how bad they're going to get. So my understanding of this drash is that the honest revelation after prayer is probably understood by the Rebbe as something very deeply individual to the person's lived experience and to what's going on for them. And the Rebbe also had a lot of suffering in his life, really just immense suffering. And of course, he is in the Warsaw Ghetto. He's with his flock in the Warsaw Ghetto. Another thing to know, I don't know if this happened before or after this drash, but I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm mistaken about this, that people had actually offered him passage out of Europe. And there were some Hasidic Rebbes who actually did take passage out of Europe, leaving their folks behind in some cases, which is another conversation for another day, but that did happen. But the Piaseczna did not do that. He felt very strongly that it was his job to stay with his people. So I sense that the answer there is going to be deeply related to suffering and how one understands suffering and how one experiences it. I hope that answered that question, and I'm really happy to talk more about that offline.
So two related questions. Is there any sense in his commentary that the rabbi understood the dire circumstances he and residents of the Warsaw Ghetto were in? And then related, why do you think he wrote about this personal relationship with God? Do you think it's to comfort the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto and their realization that things were about to get much worse and that they would need personal comfort?
Yeah, you know, there have been several scholars who've written on the Piaseczna and have tried to understand specifically the teachings in Aish Kodesh vis-a-vis the context in which they're happening. My understanding, my cursory understanding, is that I don't feel very clear. I had the same question, truthfully, whether or not the Piaseczna understood how dire things were going to get. There are people who feel that even amidst how dire things got, that his emunah, his faith, never wavered. We'll be looking at this, our last session, the final commentary in Aish Kodesh on Shabbat Chazon is one of the harder commentaries in the Sefer, but I think because that was in 1942, I think by that point, he really was deeply in touch with how bad it was getting. There were parts in the winter where you would notice, if you have a chance to look at the book, that as the years go on, the commentaries are spaced further and further apart. And my understanding is the reason for that partially is because the conditions were so bad the conditions were so bad, people were freezing, he literally was not able to physically write as often. So, and I'm noticing as I'm saying that, I think I need to go back and clarify something. I do believe, I may have misstated in the beginning of this year, and I'm gonna go back and I'm gonna clarify and make sure that I'm speaking correctly. I think he actually may have written all of these himself after Shabbat. I may have been confusing him with other Rebbes who their disciples wrote down the commentaries they heard after. I think I misspoke. He actually wrote these. So apologies, as I realized that I inadvertently confused him with other Rebbes in that regard. So I think that he had a sense of how bad things were getting. And in terms of why is he talking about this relationship with God, you know, I would personally like to believe that it did have a lot to do with comfort, that it did have a lot to do with this idea that God is in the field. Another thing is that Parashat Ki Tetzei in the calendar, in the Jewish calendrical cycle, this is just now occurring to me, thank you for the question, is often, I believe, often read during the month of Elul. And the month of Elul is the final month in the Jewish calendar before the high holidays. And this is a time, Elul, Anila Dodi, V'Dodi Li, on the acronym Aleph Lamed Vav Lamed, is understood as I am my beloved's and my beloved's is mine, meaning in this case that God is in the field, which means that God is imminently accessible in Elul. That God is always accessible, but Kol V'Chomer, all the more so in Elul. And I would want to verify. I'd want to look up, was this actually read during Elul of 1940? But in that case, it wouldn't surprise me if part of it is A, there is the desire for comfort, and B, that we're talking in a month on the calendar in which Hashem is imminently available. I also wonder if there could be a piece of this as the high holidays are coming, and who knows what kind of religious activity. I think this is something that we can really relate to right now. Who knows what kind of religious activity in terms of gathering, in terms of resources would be able to happen. So I wonder, I can't say that with I can't say that definitively that that's what was going on, but I do wonder if that was a significant piece of the puzzle.
Okay, we have an interesting question from Sarah. Is the implication of everyone receiving their own personal Torah that everyone should have an opportunity to teach their Torah to others? That each person should seek to teach their Torah to others? Just that each person has their own unique experience of Torah and or God, which they could keep to themselves?
I would say so. I do feel that that is a really strong implication, that we all can teach Torah to one another. And I imagine that that can play itself out in a variety of ways. It can either be, you know, we're teaching Torah to larger audiences, we're teaching Torah to each other in smaller spaces, but I do think that it is very much about each person being empowered to teach that piece of Torah. And that's part of my theology, personally, that I think we are deeply enriched when we are allowing all of Torah that we receive to be put into the world, that we have this collective Torah, but that we each have that individual piece of it that really resonates. And that when we teach that piece to others, we really increase Torah learning in the world. In a deeply significant way, that I don't feel, it is my personal feeling that when we read anything, whether it's a sefer, whether it's a book of Torah or a commentary or any of those things, we are inherently reading through the lenses of our experiences in the world. And so that can allow us to, that can allow us to have a variety of insights that would emerge for us that may not emerge for someone else. So yeah, I think this is a very empowering idea.
Question from Arnold. At what stage in the development of Judaism did the blessing as we know it evolve? How old is this tradition and the first person addressing of God?
So that's a really fantastic question, and I'm going to try to give as brief an answer as I can, and I'm happy to continue this conversation offline and next week as well. So the first printed prayer book that we know is from Seder Amram, Seder Amram, which was in the 9th century of the Common Era. Now, prayers existed long before that. There's a tractate of the Gemara called Brachot, which is all about blessings. And in that tractate, the rabbis, and when I say the rabbis here, I'm talking specifically about the sages of the Talmud, so the rabbis who codified the Mishnah in 200 of the Common Era, and rabbis who codified the Gemara in about 500 to 700 of the Common Era, are really trying to figure this entire thing out about brachot. What brachot do we say at what time? So this is a pretty old tradition. And if we go back even further, actually, for those of us outside of Israel, we just read Parashat Naso last week. And one of the central things in Parashat Naso is the priestly blessing, sometimes also known in English as the threefold blessing, the blessing of Yivarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha, that may God bless you and keep you. So that is one of the oldest biblical texts, although the form of that bracha is very different from the blessings we say. So I believe that the blessings that we say are as old as the Mishnah, which would have been about 1800 years ago. So relatively, it's interesting when we think about the spectrum of Jewish history, right? Because what we think of as old in modern, and those of us who are in the United States or in Canada or in North America in general, we tend to think in pretty short spurts of time. So like when we think about the whole like arc of Jewish history, I would say that it's pretty old, but it's not, it's a fairly old tradition that we are all now practicing. Rabbinic Judaism is pretty old at this point. It's almost 2,000 years old. But Judaism itself, or the Jewish community, is traditionally understood to be at least 4,000 years. So somewhere in the middle, I would say, of the arc of our people's history up until this point.
Okay, great. A question from Andrew. From his understanding of Revelation, does this mean no one person can claim they have the final or complete understanding of Torah?
Thank you, Andrew, for that beautiful question. That is an implication that I certainly take. One of the things that is really important to know about how Jewish tradition understands itself, there are two pieces to this. I think the most honest way that I can address this is, on the one hand, when Rabbinic Judaism, as I have been taught the history of Rabbinic Judaism, and there are certainly different approaches to this, as I have been taught it, the rabbis were very interested in putting forward a very particular way of continuing Judaism after the Churban, after the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple. So on the one hand, there's certainly that impulse that the rabbis wanted to have some kind of authority or power, whatever word we want to use there. I'm always hesitant to use very contemporaneous language to talk about Rabbinic Judaism because it was just a completely different cultural context than we are in. That having been said, Torah has never been centralized in the way that other religious traditions are. So part of that comes from the fact that we believe that the Jewish tradition holds that Torah was revealed to us collectively on Mount Sinai. And so therefore, we can't say, okay, my reading of Torah is the definitive reading, full stop. Many of us human beings like to do that because we like to be right and we like to have, our reading be validated. But I think our tradition really asks and pushes us to say, okay, is this reading correct? Is this reading the only reading that could exist? Or how do I push my own boundaries so that I understand how other readings of Torah emerge? So I would certainly affirm that that is a deep implication of the work of this teaching, and also that Hasidic teachers in general read Torah in very different ways than folks who are not part of the Hasidic community and folks who are not part of other communities. There's a lot of ways in which verses are read in very unique and figurative and more expansive ways.
Great. Rachel has a question. Is the rabbi saying that the experience of suffering is an essential part of this personal revelation through prayer?
I love that question. I'm not sure if it's an essential. I think the way that I understand this at this point is that it's inevitable, right? The idea that suffering happens in the world. We experience, like, we experience up and downs, we experience different things in our lives. I don't think, though, that it is essential. I think that we all experience, and this is how I understand it, that we all experience different periods of suffering to whatever degree that manifests in our life journey. But I don't think that it's absolutely essential. I think that we experience this kind of inner, or according to this teaching, as I understand it, this inner communing with Hashem can happen regardless of our circumstances.